Hello, everybody. This is my screencast on Reconstruction. And as I told you on Google Classroom, this will be in part 1 and part 2. And so you don't have to watch both parts in one day. It's just going to depend on where you are in class. So these slides are from a textbook that I have adopted or that I've been using for some time. And so I will use these, and I just wanted to give credit where credit is due. And so we need to start talking about, now that the Civil War is over and we have an issue, right? We have some major issues, in fact, that includes what are we supposed to do with 4 million freed slaves? And what are we supposed to do with Confederates? These are people who had, rebelled against the United States and had tried to leave the country in order to preserve their own way of life. And so there's a lot of really big issues. And so I think, the government is trying to figure out how to make a plan. And the problem is there are, of course, competing interests. And so President Lincoln is going to come up with one plan. President Johnson is going to come up with another. Congress is going to come up with yet even a third. And so it becomes increasingly harder, and fights kind of break out when they're trying to decide what to do with the United States going forward. And so, as we know, the South, most of the war was fought in the South. And so there were lots and lots of areas that just lay in ruins, as this picture suggests. And so it was important to unify as a country again at the end of this war so that they can make sure that something like this never happened again. And as we know, this process is called Reconstruction. So Americans were forced to consider some very difficult questions. What is going to happen with those 4 million people that are freed from slavery? Should they give them land? Should they give them jobs? Should they help them go to school? And who would help all these homeless refugees as well, who needed shelter, who needed work, who needed food to survive? And then what do we do with the Confederates, the people who had fought against the country? So what do we do with their land? Should we take away their land? And in fact, some land had already been taken away. So should they give it back? Or should they give that land to the freed people as sort of a justice for what had happened? And President Lincoln starts to come up with one plan, and Congress, like I said, came up with another. So President Lincoln's plan was the 10% plan. And he said, okay, if 10% of the state's voters swear an oath of loyalty to the United States, then they can organize a new state government and they can be readmitted to the United States. Whereas Congress passed a bill called the Wade-Davis bill, and they said, no, we want more than just 10%. They said when we have 50% of states' voters swear loyalty to the United States, then they could organize a new government. So Lincoln's 10% plan made it a lot easier for the Southern states to rejoin the Union. So, of course, if they swore loyalty, the 10%, then they could form this new state government, but they would also receive amnesty, meaning essentially they would be kind of forgiven for what had happened. But if government declared an end to slavery, then the state could then take part in national government again, meaning that they could rejoin the House of Representatives and the Senate. But the Wade-Davis bill was much stricter. So, of course, we know that, as I said earlier, 50% of the state's voters had to swear loyalty. And people in that state who had voluntarily fought for the Confederacy would not have voting rights. And so that was way stricter than Lincoln. And Lincoln refused to sign this bill. He said, no, we need to try to make it so that this is a peaceful rejoining of these states into the Union. And he's trying to sort of balance that justice versus healing. And he thought that if the Wade-Davis bill, in fact, passed, that it would not at all produce healing. It would actually make people more upset. So Republicans, like Lincoln, had a lot of different views about how to keep their party strong in this sort of new South. And Lincoln thought that there should be a soft policy that should win him support from Southerners. He wanted to, again, make it so that the Southerners felt like it was relatively easy to come back into the Union. But others argued, well, we don't want this happening again, what already happened. And so we need the South not to regain power, and we need to weaken their control. And the government also had to deal with the needs of freedmen. What was starting to occur in the South, starting in 1865, was that Southerners were passing laws called Black Codes. And they included rules such as that, for example, blacks had to have written evidence of employment by the time, for the coming year in January. And then if they left their job before the end of that contract, not only could they potentially be arrested, but they would have to give back the wages that they earned. There were some other Black codes that prohibited blacks from holding any position other than a farmer or a servant unless they paid a tax. And then there is even one more example that I'll give you where it made it illegal for a Black person or a person of mixed race to intermarry with a white person. So Southern states start to institute these rules, and the Republicans and Northerners particularly start to really push back and say, we need to do something. And so they created what they called the Freedmen's Bureau. And their first duty was, of course, to provide emergency relief to those people who were displaced from the war. But then you're going to see that they start setting up schools in the South. They act as sort of a go-between with freed people and then, the masters that perhaps they once served. And maybe they go back and they work on that land of their old master, but they do so for pay. Right. And so this becomes important because a lot of the slaves don't have an education and might not understand the contracts that they were signing for, working for anyone, not just even their former masters. And public schools in the South, this is pivotal because not only, of course, does it just start the education system for freed people, but it actually starts to educate more white people as well. And we're talking poor whites who perhaps didn't have access to education before, as well as those who were wealthy. So, as I said, the Freedmen's Bureau helped former slaves find jobs. It resolved disputes between white Americans and freedmen. And it also set up their own courts to deal with some disputes rather than go through the state courts, because the states were actually still trying to figure out if they can have a state government. And the federal government was, in fact, holding the line and saying, nope, not until you have this loyalty oath and not until you come back officially into the United States. Now, President Lincoln, with his 10% plan, didn't live to put this plan into practice. Shortly thereafter, at the end of the Civil War, he was shot by a Confederate sympathizer while he was attending a play. And so the Confederate sympathizer was John Wilkes Booth. He was later captured and killed as well. But many Americans were very shocked by Lincoln's death. Now, Lincoln's successor was his vice president, who was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson's an interesting guy. He was a Southern Democrat, but he had not been okay with slavery. And he, in fact, was sort of disenfranchised and didn't like the sort of atmosphere of these wealthy Southern planters getting able to make all the decisions in the South. And so he had remained loyal to the Union. Now, many Americans figured that he was going to actually have a really strict approach to Reconstruction. But in fact, what's interesting is that's not really what ended up happening. So we're going to move on to this part of the presentation, which talks about how disagreements over Reconstruction led to even more conflicts in the government and in the South. So Johnson and Congress disagreed vehemently over plans for Reconstruction. And as you're going to see, this led for a battle for power. And in fact, Andrew Johnson was later impeached by Congress because sort of stemming from all of these, conflicts and arguments that they were getting into. Now, like Lincoln, President Johnson said, you know what, we need to not have a really strict Reconstruction plan. We need to give amnesty to most former Confederates and allow them to organize new governments and start to elect congressmen because they should have a say in Congress. And his plan also did require, though, that the states ratify the 13th Amendment, which said that all states in the United States had to abolish slavery and any form of forced labor. And this gave Congress the power to actually make laws to enforce this as well. The problem is, though, is that most people saw that Johnson's approach was too lenient. And they said, you're pretty much allowing the southern states free reign to put themselves back together and bring them back into the country. And as I said before, we have black codes that are almost, supporting a system of near slavery for these freed people. And so what starts to happen is you have other Republicans in Congress that are now going to be called the radical Republicans. They are people who want to take a more radical approach than what we're seeing with Johnson's sort of lenient approach. And so the struggle over Reconstruction leads to direct clashes between the president and Congress. So Congress, in 1865, I do want to point out actually really quick, is that Johnson ends up instituting his own presidential Reconstruction plan while Congress is not in session. So we're talking May of 1865, right? And so then Congress was in recess. They don't even come back until December of 1865. And Johnson says, oh, no, Reconstruction's done. I fixed it. I did this presidential Reconstruction plan. We're good. And Congress is like starting to look into it. And they're like, yeah, no, we don't agree. We think that there is way more to be done. And so, for example, one of the things that they do is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And this gives citizenship to African Americans, and in fact is a landmark law for civil rights. But Johnson vetoes the bill. Now, for the first time in history, something is going to be done, and this is that it will go back to Congress, and Congress needs to have a two-thirds majority or two-thirds vote to override the veto. And in fact, they did. They were able to gain it because a lot of moderate Republicans joined with these radical Republicans. And so Congress overturned the veto, and it did, in fact, become law. And like I said, this is the first time in history that is so. This is going to be the end of part 1, and part 2 will be coming up in just a moment. All right, here we are for part 2 of our Reconstruction Screencast. So where we left off, Johnson had vetoed the Civil Rights Act, and we know, of course, that Congress went and passed it and overrode his veto. So next, Congress goes and they pass the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that all people born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens, and that it must allow males over the age of 21 to vote. Now, you might be interested and think to yourself, well, don't you have to be 18 to vote? That actually doesn't happen until later. The voting age was 21 for some time, and then it was changed later on. So the 14th Amendment, a lot of historians call it the second Constitution because it redefines the United States. And the 14th Amendment is an incredibly important constitutional amendment that, in fact, is still argued today and eventually gets to be interpreted in a variety of ways too, for example, rights of women and rights of other people who might not be citizens in the U.S. So really a groundbreaking amendment in many ways. Now, in looking at the plans that Congress starts to come up with, what they start to see is that violence is occurring throughout the United States. There are some examples of riots occurring in Memphis, in New Orleans, between freed blacks, between police, and then freed blacks and whites as well. And so they start to see that, this plan that Johnson is saying is done and, oh yeah, Reconstruction has been achieved, doesn't really seem to actually have worked. And they perhaps need a new plan. And so Andrew Johnson, again, his plan says that a majority of white men have to swear the oath of loyalty, they have to ratify the 13th Amendment, and that former Confederate officials are allowed to vote and hold office. But now there's that new group of Republicans, the radical Republicans, that say, no, we want state governments to disband and write completely new constitutions. We want them to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments, and they must allow all African Americans to vote, all African American men, I should say, to vote. Now, radical Republicans start actually gaining the support of moderate Republicans, particularly because President Johnson is kind of ticking off these moderate Republicans. And so they pass the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which now we call, because it's a series of reforms, we call these reforms radical Reconstruction. And so this says that Southern states had to do these three things at the bottom in order to return to the Union. Now, this, of course, goes a lot further than presidential Reconstruction had. And in fact, one of the things that it does is it imposes a military rule on states. So they actually send troops down and they put them into these military districts and say, okay, the military will be here to keep the peace until you all get your act together and sort of come back into the Union. And so you'll see here, for example, are the years that they start to be admitted to the Union. So 1868, 1866, 1870, and so on. Now, radical Reconstruction did bring about many improvements. So as we talked before, Southern states start opening up public schools for whites and blacks. They freed people start actually participating a lot more in their government, and I'll show you that on the next slide. Taxes and voting rules become fairer across the spectrum for all citizens, and states rebuild bridges, roads, building, and legislators even start to grant women property rights. And as I said, for the first time in American history, blacks in the South play a pretty active role in politics. We have some of the first elected officials to local and then statewide offices. And then we also have Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce become the nation's first African American senators in Congress. Now, the Republican Party starts to build up a very strong base during this time. And it sort of is made up of three groups and some other groups as well. So first we have the freed people voters. Then we have people that they call scalawags. And these were Southern whites who had opposed secession. So meaning they had opposed leaving the Union in the first place. And the third were carpetbaggers, or Northern whites who had come to work in the South. Oftentimes you saw them as perhaps working for the Freedmen's Bureau to help freed people get jobs and such, as we talked about before. Sometimes they came down to take advantage of some of the economic opportunities, but usually when a Southerner talked about a carpetbagger, it wasn't in a good way. It was usually a pejorative term. Now, the Republicans also started to appeal to outsiders in politics, people who perhaps were white but not slaveholders, people who might have been small slaveholders, people who were black Northerners. And so I don't want you to think it's just these three groups that draws their support from the Republican Party. It's actually many more as well. Now, Johnson really, as I said, had a lot of trouble with Congress, and his disagreements with them actually led to his impeachment in 1868. So he did have an impeachment trial, but he was not removed from Congress. So Ulysses S. Grant, I'm not removed from Congress, I'm sorry, not removed from the presidency. He had enough votes to stay in office. But by 1868, Ulysses S. Grant actually won the presidential election anyway, and Ulysses S. Grant was famous for being a general during the Civil War. Grant was a moderate, and so we actually start to see that the radicals begin to lose power in the government. And by 1869, Congress approves the 15th Amendment, which said that states have to allow African Americans to vote. And so what starts to happen is extremist groups start to pop up, including the Ku Klux Klan. And they rose really in response to Reconstruction as a whole, but particularly by 1868, they're actually turning to violence to stop people from voting. So in 1870, Congress passes a series of acts that gives the government power to respond to Klan violence. And it even allows them to arrest them on federal charges. And so we see the federal government stepping in to try to protect the rights of African American voters. All right, on to the last part of this. Although, of course, the reforms of the Reconstruction were, I think, well-intentioned, particularly to those freed people, it unfortunately still produced a lot of challenges, and the reforms did not last. And so by 1870, we have the last of the Confederate states being readmitted to the Union, and many thought that Reconstruction was over. People in the North began to turn their attentions elsewhere, particularly because President his presidential administration is rife with scandals, and particularly with corruption. And the economy, in fact, crashes in 1873. And so Americans sort of stop focusing on Reconstruction and stop focusing on the Civil War and focus on their own lives instead. By 1876, we have another presidential election, which was hotly contested. There was widespread voter intimidation, violence, and fraud in the South, some of it perhaps even perpetrated by the Democratic candidate, who was Samuel J. Tilden. Now, Tilden wants to end Reconstruction, but Rutherford B. Hayes says, nope, I think that Reconstruction is not done yet, and I think that we need to continue it. But the election was so disputed, as you can see here from this map, and it really came down to 20 votes. And so what happens if an election is disputed ever in America, this is in our Constitution, is that it goes to the House of Representatives. And so the House of Representatives forms a commission, and in this 15-person commission, who are mostly made up of Republicans, they decide to give Rutherford B. Hayes all of the electoral votes, and he, in turn, becomes president. Now, Hayes didn't win by much. Hayes only won from, a 15-person commission. He won 8-7. So that was pretty contested as well. But there were fears that a new civil war was going to happen. And so Hayes kind of understood and knew that he needed to diffuse the situation. And so he agrees that he is going to end Reconstruction and that he is going to take the remaining troops out of the southern states. Now, many say that this was the end of Reconstruction officially in 1877. Unfortunately, what starts to happen is that African Americans begin to lose their rights in the South. Southern whites start passing more and more laws to keep them from voting. One, for example, is a poll tax, which says that you have to pay a tax in order to vote. Another one is a literacy test, which were incredibly difficult tests that you had to pass to show that you were literate. In fact, many white Southerners couldn't, in fact, pass this literacy test. Another was a grandfather clause that said that if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote, right? And again, if your grandfather was a slave, then of course you couldn't vote. So these laws start to be known as Jim Crow laws. And we're going to talk about the history of that term Jim Crow at another time. But they continue to be passed in the South with little federal interference. The federal government does not step in very much. And so we start to see the segregation of whites and blacks in society. And one such Jim Crow law almost entirely wiped out the black vote in Louisiana. So the number of black voters went in Louisiana from 130,000 to 1,000 people because of these Jim Crow laws. Now, one landmark case was in 1896, and this is when the Supreme Court upheld segregation laws. So Homer Plessy was arrested for sitting in a coach marked for whites only. And so he went to court and appealed it. And the court actually said that segregation was legal so long as they were separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites. And this rule remains in effect until the 1950s. You have probably in the past learned about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and so on. And this was them protesting against the separate but equal doctrine that came out of this landmark Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, in the South, many poor African Americans were forced to become sharecroppers. So sharecropping is when the landowners would give land, seed, and tools in exchange for a share of the crop, and the tenant would buy the other supplies they needed on credit. The landowners would then sell the crop, and the tenant would get a share minus what they owed for the supplies. But what would happen is most of the sharecroppers owed more than they earned. And in fact, it wasn't fair at all. And they went in this vicious cycle of continued poverty because they might have owed their landlord for the crops, for the seed, for the tools, or other supplies that they had. And it was actually very common in the South. As you can see, the darker blue areas that had 35 to 80% of farms sharecropped. And then we had the sort of brighter green areas had 21 to 34%, and the lighter green areas were 0 to 20%. Now, the South's economy does begin to gradually recover. We start to see, of course, that some of the Traditional crops that are planted in the South, like cotton and tobacco, they do continue to thrive. But they also start to see that, hey, you know what, we need to diversify our economy and go beyond these cash crops. And so other industries and factories also begin to occur and to be built in the South. Now, Reconstruction has many successes, but a lot of failures as well. And it's even hotly contested among historians. While it did set forth constitutional amendments that were pivotal and supremely important in our history, it did not entirely help the country heal, nor was justice perhaps really achieved for freed people either. So, as we will see, blacks were citizens, but the Jim Crow laws and the black codes became the foundation of the protests that we're going to see in the civil rights movement almost 100 years later.